and unfortunately I have to rise and speak on this bill. It's disappointing to have to do so because all of my life, I've always categorised the Labor Party as being the wreckers of the Australian workforce. I grew up listening to my father constantly tell me how the wharfies went on strike in World War II, wouldn't help our troops out, wouldn't export our wool, etc., etc. And if this bill, I don't really see this bill as being the final nail in the coffin for a small industry and small business here in Australia. No, no, no. The Labor Party put the final nail in the coffin a long time ago into the coffin small business. I call this the grave diggers bill. Basically, we're now chucking dirt on small business so that they'll be completely forgotten about and erased from history 6 feet under, with this ridiculous idea that we can have multi-patent and bargaining. But that is the Labor for you. They have to mandate everything. Every rules, they just have to. There's no individual in the Labor Party's psyche. No, 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 no. It's just communism. We're going to own all the property. We're going to have one set of rules, and we see that constantly. Everything the Labor Party does is all about centralisation, command and control. We saw it with the superannuation in the early 90s, where they have slowly but surely raised the superannuation level from 2% to 12%, and if they get their way, they get a second term, they're already talking about lifting it to 15%. Why don't you just take 100% of it now? Do you know what I mean? This is the Labor Party. It's like childcare. They want to tell parents, if you want any childcare support, you have to give it to the childcare centre, because that way they get to unionise parenthood. This is actually why they push childcare so high, because without childcare, the union movement, which is down to about 10% of the workforce, would be much, much lower. The only sort of childcare union that is rising in this country is United Voice, because of the subsidies going into the childcare sector. And it goes on and on and on. We see it with the renewable energy target. Started off at 5%, then it went to 23%, then it's got to go to 43%, and then it's going to be net zero. And it'll go on and on and on. It's important to note just how much damage the Labor Party has done to industry, especially small business. And I just want to reflect on the election last weekend, and of course Labor's gloating because they won. They won the election, that's right. But you know who lost? Victoria. But Victoria didn't lose the election lose out last weekend. They started to lose out 40 years ago when the former Labor Senator for Victoria, John Button, introduced the Button Plan, which basically saw the destruction, which was the first step in the destruction of the manufacturing industry in Victoria. Victoria was once the jewel in the crown of the Liberal Party because of that strong manufacturing base that has had the guts ripped out of it, and if they weren't forced to close down, they've gone offshore, because effectively we had this crazy neoliberal ideology that somehow we were going to compete against cheap Asian imports, which never happened. And all that's done is destroy Victoria. And you combine that, the Button Plan in '85, with the Dawkins Plan in 1990, where everyone got to go to university and get a degree. So because of that ridiculous policy that was introduced, another crazy Hawke-Keating policy, is that we've now got the situation whereby we've got all of these students and these Marxist academics controlling Victoria. And then a couple of years later we got the compulsory superannuation, which gave us another army of financial engineers in Victoria, and most of the industry super funds are centred out of Victoria, despite the fact that these guys have over, well, I think they're well over $1 trillion, but there's over $3 trillion now in super and climbing. I mean, it is effectively going to be bigger than our GDP, and this wealth is centralised in the hands of unelected board members. You want to talk about democracy, mate? I'm telling you, we are not living in a democratic society in this country, when you have got trillions of dollars of wealth and our infrastructure controlled by unelected superannuation boards, both private and industry. I'm not taking sides when it comes to superannuation. The whole lot of it is communism and Marxism and fascism rolled into one, if you ask me. But I can tell you that with the fact that we then walked away from TAFE and hands-on people that actually built things in this country, destroyed our manufacturing sector, destroyed our small business, we have now got more people on the teat of the nation, relying on government handouts, through universities, through ever-increasing superannuation policy, academics, you name it, has made our country very, very unproductive. Very, very unproductive. And then we moved forward 2 generations when we had the introduction of the Fair Work Act. And of course there's nothing fair about the Fair Work Act. And interestingly enough, the head of the Fair Work Commission was Ian Ross, who Paul Keating himself admitted was the architect of superannuation, along with himself and Bill Kelty. And of course they must have been sitting back there in a room somewhere in the early 90s thinking, how can we take over this country? I've got to hand it. I've got to hand it to the Labor Party, because when it comes to bringing in communism by stealth in this country, you guys have done a very, very good job of it. Because I've got to admit, while our guys are out there talking about free markets, and I can tell you I've had over 30 years in finance, I've never seen freedom as a line item on the balance sheet. If you want to be free, you've got to be productive. Our freedom comes from affluence, which comes from productivity, and we should never, ever forget that. Indeed, Robert Menzies himself said we should not go back to the old and selfish notions of laissez-faire. And he also said that the rich and powerful should look after themselves. But what we should be focused on, while we were focusing on the so-called ideology of the free market, the left over here, the unions, were actually ripping out ever-increasing amounts of superannuation from workers' pay packets. Now, I fail to see how you think we can either live in a country with a free market when the government is taking a percentage of the workers' wages, never even asked them. There was never a referendum about superannuation in this country. New Zealand had a referendum about compulsory superannuation. They voted against it 92% to 8. All right? No, we weren't asked about that in this country. The Labor Party just decided to jack it up, and they're pinching money. I mean, this is super, right? This is what they do with superannuation. They have that little ad where they do this. Well, I'll tell you what this is symbolic for. This is then what happens is that the industry fees take their fees, like this, the industry funds, and then Labor comes along and picks up the fees behind their back just like that. That is the way that the Labor Party work, and that is, this is another, bit of compliance on small business. When you've got to fill out your superannuation forms, you've got all these rules. It's more compliance for small business, and it takes a lot of time. I've worked in public practices before, and it's very time-consuming just to even pay that extra 9 going on to 10.5%. But can I say this bill is riddled with so much conflict and complexity and uncertainty, and the industry is extremely concerned. They don't want to be dragged into multi-enterprise bargaining, and it's based on this very vague notion of a common interest. Common interest. Well, I can tell you that common interest is double-speak for communism. It's effectively, how on earth, I can just see this ending up in courts. Can you just imagine Fair Work going to Fair Work with the word common interest, and when you've got Fair Work stacked with Labor appointees, they are going to be actually punishing small business every opportunity they get. And it is going to make it very difficult. And this is going to actually punish the workers of this country, because small business just won't want to employ anybody when they don't, they can be held to ransom by such vague terms as common interest. And I don't know about you, but it's all these vague notions just do my head in. Coming from a background in mathematics, I've got to find all these warm and fuzzy terms that Labor use to hide their communism and Marxism and all of this sort of stuff. It's all very scary. It's all very, very scary. But I can assure you what this bill will do, apart from put people out of work, it's going to increase the cost of living, and if it doesn't send businesses broke, it's going to send them offshore. And it's certainly not going to attract other companies coming in and setting up business here, because why would you, when you can be held to ransom by the Fair Work Act? It's a real concern that Labor want to bring in, and it's not surprising because this is what Labor do. They aren't going to finish, they aren't going to stop until there is no more private property left in this country. and free thought is completely destroyed. No, 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 no. We don't want private property in this country. This is the way the Labor Party think. And we don't want businesses to be flexible and innovative and to be able to think for themselves. And we don't want the employee and the employer to build up a relationship between each other. Right? That's, and this is what with enterprise bargaining, you could trust, the employer and employee. We would let them actually negotiate the best terms and tailor the best terms that suited them. That's why I don't believe in any mandates. That's why I took a stand on vaccine mandates, because I think you've got to respect the individual. That is what this party should stand for, which is the dignity and worth of every individual. It's got to stand for the freedom of choice, the freedom of conscience. We've got to have flexibility, the ability to innovate, and that sort of stuff is what creates enterprise and entrepreneurship that will drive productivity in this country. And with productivity comes affluence, and with affluence becomes freedom and the ability not to have to rely on that big sucking monolith.
Senator Rennick, the time for your debate.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.